So, wow, I don't need to hold this very close. So first of all, I'd like to start with a little bit of audience engagement. So how many of you have ever shot a basketball at a hoop and missed? Or went to a poker game and put money in the pot and then lost it? Well, it turns out that's really not that much different than proposal writing. The point being is you've got to take shots to win, and you're not going to win every shot. And so you got to decide how to make those shots count. You've got to decide which pot do you want to be in, right? And that's a part of what I'll go over. I'd rather just make this very interactive, and so rather than take questions at the end, I can take questions anytime. So feel free to just sort of raise your hand, yell at me. I'm happy to jump in and answer questions. If there are questions online as well, I'm happy to answer those if somebody will just chime up as to what those questions are. So John, thank you. I titled this, even though the title of the actual session, a little differently, and you'll see why when I get into it. The good, the bad, and the ugly, not the good, the bad. So that's actually on purpose. It's not a spelling mistake. And you'll see why. And it has to do with a particular example that I encountered in my career. So first of all, I'll say that I've been on both sides of the street. And let me see if I can advance the slides too. So I've been on both sides of the street. I spent the first 9 years of my career in industry. I worked for a small company, 100 employees. We got bought out by a mid-sized company called Antion Corporation, about 7,000 employees. Then they got bought out by a 70,000 employee company called General Dynamics. So I did that for quite some time, and I realized once I was working for one of the largest defense contractors in the United States, why don't I just go work for the government, which is, you know, the largest employer in the world. And so I decided to switch over to the government service, and I did that for 14 years. And then recently I switched back out of the government back into industry, working for Parallax as a nonprofit. And my prior job to my current title, which is up there, was to do technology pull. And what that means is that I would go to the users in the Air Force, find out what they needed, and then see what technologies were out there in the world of the science and technology development universe, and say, here's a match. This technology could be used to solve this problem with the F-35, or this problem with a command and control system. And so I did that for a year and a half before transitioning just recently to a vice president position. So, you know, a little more about me. I grew up as a software developer. I started out writing code, did that for a period of time. Then I switched over to lead software development position, and then eventually switched over to being the program manager when I went to the government in that position. So while I went through these different companies, it's actually the same title, same job, same desk. So that's very common in the industry. So I went from a programmer to a program manager. And then I went back and got my PhD in artificial intelligence. So I went back to being an engineer. And really what I do now is sort of a blend of all those things. So I work in the business development environment, but I also do technical work. And so what you're going to get from me is a flavor of how to build a technical proposal, not necessarily a flavor of how to build a proposal that's going to be perfect from a contracts perspective, because my contracts background is only through interacting on the program manager side. I mentioned most of the other things. You can read the rest of it here. In terms of source selection sizes, I've worked on one that was just under 250 million, and you'll find that the government loves to write a number that's just below a certain cap. So there's certain caps that require additional authorities to be approved. And so the biggest one I worked on was 250 million. Most of the ones I worked on were around $10 million to $50 million. Anything under 100 million now requires a certain level of approval. Anything over 100 million up to 250 million requires a different level of approval, et cetera. And because of that, you know, I've seen everything from these large proposals that come from large defense contractors all the way to small civers and sitters. So I've myself have probably looked at 200 civer proposals at a time. For instance, one topic alone had 44 different proposals against it. So you can imagine when you have 44 different proposals, you've got a lot of reading to do. And you're not always doing it alone, you're doing it in a team. But in that case, I read every one of those proposals and helped to evaluate those proposals over time. So I'm happy to ask or answer any questions as it comes to you as we go along through this discussion. So, and can you advance the slides for me? A slide, please. So, briefly, I want to talk about the types of proposals, and the reason why I provide this is, you know, it's very easy for us to jump down into CiberSitter and talk only about CiberSitter, but the government's a big place, right? And you can write a proposal for a grant, for instance, and it's got a very different type of contract vehicle associated with it, and a very different type of look and feel in terms of the proposal. And so while oftentimes we focus on CiberSitter because it is particularly keyed towards the small business audience, there are other places in the government that you can partner with an academic partner, for instance, and work on a grant, or you can partner with a large business and be a subcontract to that large business and provide a solution to a very large proposal process, but understanding how these things work and the types of services and contracts is helpful. So the first type, for instance, is called ANAS services, or administrative and assistant services. And advisory services, sorry. And ANAS services typically refer to sort of quasi-government positions. In this case, you're in the loop, actually seeing the same data that the government is seeing. You'll see the government budgets, for instance, and all of the things that are within the government. Those are usually very trusted positions, and so oftentimes the government is looking for a company that has done this work before, and usually they're looking for somebody that has an approved accounting system. So typically, companies that get into this aren't new startups. They're, you know, somebody on the order of, you know, a couple of hundred employees to maybe 1,000 employees. The big guys don't go after ANAS services oftentimes because there's a conflict of interest between understanding what's going on internal to the government and being able to work on the competitive side of industry. And so they don't necessarily want to say, I'm going to go after, say, the services around developing subs when I actually want to build the submarine myself, because there's more money in building the submarine than there is in ANAS services. But understand that that type of contract does exist. There's also sort of an in-house research role, and you'll see these come across the street at AFRL. They are contracts that will look at, I need some research, and I need some world-class researchers to work or pair with my guys that are in the labs. And oftentimes you're working side by side in a government facility in this model, providing research for them. It is not quite ANAS services because you don't have access to all of the things that make inherently government data, like what the actual budgets are. But what you do instead is you provide research alongside of the government, and the government will direct you on a daily basis. So these contracts are fairly loose in scope. They don't have a lot of detail as to what they're asking for, and so when you see something like, our goal is, we're thinking about doing these sorts of things, and they don't give you a tangible, what do they want at the end of it, it's probably in this category here. And I'll say that category in particular is not truly a category. It is really just sort of a part of the spectrum from develop me a widget all the way to ANAS services, and it's on the further side, closer to the services. Efforts that result in a one-of-a-kind thing. Oftentimes, you know, if we're looking at a prototype, we're looking for a given concept, we might actually write into the contract and say, here's what I want you to build, and here's how much I'm working for. The reason why I bring some of these categories in here is because there's sort of a spider web between the right and the left. So for instance, if I'm doing ANAS services, I'm probably going to be a cost reimbursable contract. If I'm doing a one-of-a-kind element, I'm probably going to be either a firm fixed fee or a cost reimbursable, or maybe a time and materials. So you can kind of think about how those look. it turns out in Silver Sitters, for instance, they changed phase ones are essentially a grant now, which means here's your money, go do stuff, and you don't need to give me a bunch of reporting on how much money you spent and where you did it, right, here's the money. And then a phase two is a different type of contract. So the contract types do change over the course of Silver Sitter, and each of those contract types have different reporting requirements, what has to go into the government, what has to be reported. So $50,000 is a lot of money, but for the Air Force, it's a very small piece of budget, and so they will treat it as a grant rather than treating it as a full-up contract and having to go through the federal acquisition regulations associated with it. So any questions on contract types? Okay, slide please. All right, so this is a bit of an eye chart, but the point is if you notice, there's a bunch of wastebaskets along the way. And it starts with you write a proposal, and you have to submit it. And if you're 1 second late, it goes in the trash can, right? And if it doesn't meet format, it may go in the trash can, or they could cut it up and only evaluate part of it. And if it doesn't sort of pass muster in terms of hitting the target, the topic, they'll throw it in the trash can, right? It turns out at the end, there's some places where they could throw all the proposals out in the trash can. I don't believe our process is fair, for instance. However, we want to define fair, and they'll say, because of that, because we didn't follow our process correctly, let's throw the whole source selection out, let's start over. Now, some of those places where you see the multiple trash cans, they cost the government a lot of money and a lot of time. Usually it's a 1-year process between when they start their cycle and the point that they actually have a contract on board. And that's probably a little bit more aggressive. For larger contracts, it's longer than that. For smaller contracts like Silver Sitters, it's probably more like 6 months. But the reality is the government costs are largely in their labor. And so they don't want to have to go back to the drawing board. But there are places along the way that go back to the drawing board. And what that makes the government is very cautious about how they're going to interact with the contractors. There are places in the cycle of writing proposals where they don't want to talk to you. And they don't want to talk to you not because you don't have great ideas, not because it wouldn't benefit them to talk to you. They don't want to talk to you because if they talk to you and they give you 20 minutes and they give somebody else 30 minutes and somebody else 40 minutes, now all of a sudden things aren't fair anymore. And so what is fair in this case? Well, they judge that by following their process. And so it's not all about the fact that they really don't want to talk to you. It's the fact that they've got a process to follow. And so you got to know when to engage, right? There's times where you can actually have those open conversations with the government, and there's times where you can't. And when you can have those open conversations, please have them. I heard earlier in the panel there was a guy that was talking about how you need to be authentic with the government. That's very true. But I'll also say that authenticity is part of it. Part of it's about listening. The government usually has some goal in mind, some thing in mind, and usually it's a big enough framework that your stuff is going to fit within it. If you're talking to a guy in the government or a gal in the government that is interested in your tech area at all, their visions are usually really big, and they're really big because the Air Force has got really big problems. And so generally speaking, you can have the conversation with them, and if all you did was say, here's all my cool stuff, they're going to see where it fits within them, but they're not going to feel like you understand their problem. And so when you go to write your proposal, they're going to go, oh my gosh, these guys, they came and they told us how cool their technology is, but I don't know if they really understand the problem. And so by listening more, at least at first, right, you're getting a feed on what they look for, and it's really a sharing, it's really a two-way dialogue. It isn't just, please tell me everything and, back the dump truck up. but it is a little bit of, help me understand your problem so that way I can better tell you about my solution. Some of the best business meetings I've been in for business development, we spent 40 minutes listening to the customer and 10 minutes telling them solutions. Okay, slide please. So I don't know that you can read this Dilbert, but it just talks about proposals and how the proposal process can really get twisted. I talked about how proposals have to be fair, and fair is defined by following the process. So the government will outline and say, here's how the process works. I'm going to put something on the street. Maybe it's a one-step process where I put the whole proposal and ask for a full proposal right off the bat. Maybe it's a two-step process where they say, give me a white paper, tell me about your idea, and then I'll decide if I want a full proposal. In the case of Sitter, for instance, it's a one-step process. You put in your proposal based upon what they have, and then they decide to select you or not select you. So oftentimes in Sitter, it's a little different than it is in some of these custom places. So if you're working directly with somebody on RightPat, you're probably working on a relationship first, and then working on a technology second, and then eventually working on a proposal for that, right? So the relationship with that program manager, with that person within the AFRL, is probably more important than your technology and how it fits within their program, although that is important. And then the second piece that's really important is how good is your technology and how's it going to solve a problem that they have, right? And then third is can I write a winning proposal? And so you can write the best proposal. If you haven't done those first two, you're going to lose. Now, I'm not saying you're going to lose every time, but your odds of winning are less, right? So when am I going to shoot at the basket, right? I'm not going to shoot at the basket when I'm on the other side of the court, right? Because it's a bad time to shoot at the basket. So let me talk to the government first. Let me understand their problem first, right? And now I'll start shooting at the basket. And so there's a process when it comes to especially working with these more custom solutions that you want to go through. Now for Sitter, it's a little different because you don't even necessarily know who's going to review it. Sibbers get farmed out across the Air Force for review. So you might be talking to somebody within the government, and you do want to do some of that conversation before you actually submit your proposal, especially in terms of, is the government even interested? How could they use it? Because you need to write that into your proposal, and you're going to need to put some of that into your proposal. But you don't necessarily need to have this strong relationship with one person, because it turns out that person is probably not the person that's actually going to select your Sibber. So for Sitter, it's less about the relationship and more about the great idea. It's more about how that great idea fits within the Air Force. And so that'll give you kind of a sense of, you can kind of tell how custom touch it is, and the more custom touch it is, the more you need to be building the relationship before you submit the proposal. I'll say that our probability of win, generally speaking, in my division, when I look at a proposal, we're cold calling somebody. We've got, say, something that came out on the street. We haven't been talking to the program manager, and we want to know, hey, is this a proposal we want to bid against? I'll put the P-win at 5 to 10%. So my expectation is we are probably not going to win that. And so why are we writing the proposal? Well, it does a couple of things. It gets us in front of the program manager for the next round, for the next proposal, right? So we're playing the long game in this case, not always taking the shot if it's a bad shot, instead passing it to a partner, figuring out how to play the long game. So in terms of fair, right, fair is they follow it at all costs. Fair is not comparing proposals against each other. You think the government's looking at your proposal going, man, your proposal is so much better than this proposal over here, or so much worse than that proposal over there. It turns out they're not allowed to do that. That's called leveling, and the courts have basically said you cannot compare proposals. So what they do instead is they compare your proposal against a grading criteria that they've set out in the solicitation effort. So for Sibbers, it's a technical and personnel and commercialization. And they'll even give you the grading rubric. 50% of your proposal is technical, 30% is commercialization, 20% is et cetera. So you've got a rubric, if you will, for where to spend your time and effort on a proposal. Now, I can tell you, good proposals generally follow that rubric, right? So if you've got, for instance, unique and innovative is one of your criteria, you probably better tell the government how your stuff is unique and innovative, right? So fair in this case is following their criteria, not comparing the proposals to each other. And lastly, fair is having an impartial judgment. And what I mean by that is say my wife worked for, I'll pick on General Dynamics because I used to work for them. Say my wife works for General Dynamics, and I met her at General Dynamics, and then I moved on to the government. At that point, I am no longer allowed to review any proposals that come in or any source selection efforts that have General Dynamics associated with it, because I have a vested interest in that company's success. And so they will pull people off of the team based upon who is bidding. So you might think your brother's the greatest guy to talk to because he happens to work in the government and you want to sell him your technology, but he may not be able to even buy your technology because he's going to be recused from the process as a part of that. So I've gone through quite a few slides already. Maybe I'll take questions now and then I can go forward from there. Yeah.
So like they're judging each proposal against that grading criteria impartially, independently. Do then, I guess they're scored and then they rank and then that's how they're chosen, or is it if that person gives it a big enough thumbs up, it's a winner?
So the question was, when they're grading the proposal, let me make sure I got this right too. When they're grading the proposal, do they independently score them, or is there one person that sort of gives you a thumbs up, thumbs down for it?
How are the winners actually selected?
So it depends on the office and the process. I've seen some be very, very clean and only go against the criteria and try to give you even a numerical score. I've seen others that say, look, we're not going to give you numbers. Instead, we're going to, and in the case of SBIR/SITR, they do give numbers to the proposal. I will say that while there shouldn't be any subjective judgment associated with it if it is a purely fair process, the reality is there is subjective judgment. What will happen is they'll say, this one's good, and this one's good as well, but I think this one's an 80 good, and this one's an 85 good, right? And that subjective judgment oftentimes comes in based upon past history that a given person or a given evaluator has with that company. So sometimes, for instance, we'll get companies that come in and they just pitch SBIR after SBIR after SBIR, you know, they call them SBIR mills. That type of company, some evaluators will discount what comes in because they'll say, hey, look, they're just in it for the next SBIR, right? They're not in it for actually putting it out into the hands of the warfighter or getting some commercialization success. They're just looking for the next bite at the apple. And so I've seen people discount that. That's unofficial, of course. It's never documented, right? But that's really kind of how the process works. And I'll say that when the process works well, people do some of that, but don't rely on it entirely. And the contracting officers will tell you absolutely that does not happen anywhere within the Air Force, right? We never do that, right? We never ever do subjective judgment. We're only doing it against the criteria. But I can tell you from an evaluator, from being actually in that evaluation room, that there's some wiggle room, right? And I get to choose, you know, I think it's a B either way, but is it a high B or a low B? Right? So I can't necessarily tell you it's an F because you can probably justify why it's not. But I've got some subjective room to move, and in that subjective room, we can make some decisions. Now I'll say that there are times where even with that subjective movement, there are still places where our hands can be tied. For instance, if I've got 3 proposals that come in, and one of them didn't write to the criteria, I throw it out right away. The other 2 are close, but one of them completely missed a sub-criteria, subsection somewhere in there, right? I can't just elevate that, what would be that proposal up to the top if the other one addressed everything well, right? So I can't make a C into an A, if you will. So the question is what's the chances of getting funding if the person resubmits several times? I would say generally lower if you don't do additional work. If you go to the government and say, how did I miss the mark here, right? And you refine your idea and you get a better understanding of what's going on within the government, or maybe the timing's off, right? You might have an idea before it's today and the government may not understand it. Understand that the government's really quite bad from a technical perspective. And I can say that being a prior Govy guy, right? The old joke was that contractors are slimy and government people are incompetent. But the reality is the government is not so deep in the technical because they've got to do all these other things that the government requires them to do. And so, you know, if I'm the safety officer, if I'm the equipment custodian, if I'm doing all these other duties, it turns out I can't be on the point end of my game for a technical perspective. And what that means is that I'm going to be a technical lightweight compared to some of the people that are proposing. And the way to handle that is to get them up to speed about your idea, get them thinking about it, and then when you resubmit, you're going to have a better chance at it. I have seen people propose already knowing they're going to lose the first time, and intentionally proposing just a teaser, if you will. Hey, would you consider this idea? If you would, please contact me. And that strategy is fairly novel, but I've seen it work occasionally, where the government has said, hey, I really should go talk to these guys after this is all done, after the source selection is done, because clearly it's not a real proposal. Maybe it's a 2-page proposal when there's supposed to be a 20-page proposal, right? But it's enough for me to go, well, I should probably read that and look at it and maybe then start up a conversation. So that is a strategy, is to somewhat sort of tease them with the idea. SIBRs are a little different because you're not guaranteed the same reviewers. As a matter of fact, most times you're probably not going to get the same reviewers. So you can throw an idea in the first time, throw it in again, throw it in again. This was especially true, by the way, when AFWERX stood up. So prior to AFWERX, there was all these ideas that were going around, and they were evaluated by AFRL and or the PEOs. So there were a lot of people that looked at ideas and said, these are the cool ideas, these are the ones I want, right? And they down-selected other ideas. Well, what happened is when AFWERX stood up, all these companies dusted off their old proposals and sent them in because they were going to be evaluated by somebody else. And most of what AFWERX funded in the first year or two, especially the first year, was old proposals. They weren't couched as old proposals, of course. They weren't written that way. But a lot of companies actually made hay on ideas that had been down-selected from a phase 1 proposal that didn't make it to a phase 2 by resubmitting it to AFWERX. Yeah.
So I'm in the offensive cybersecurity side of things. My question is there any precedent or express, say my project, they deem is some type of national security importance? Say I'm able to destabilize UAV systems or something to that effect. Does that change how things are weighted or how I'm viewed?
So the question is, if you have a great idea in a technical area that's very critical to the Air Force, like cybersecurity, does that change the weight? And I'll say yes. Relationship first in these high-touch environments, but technology second, right? And technology can be a first, if you will, if there is a major gap or a major need for technology. I'll say that when you're in that domain in security, and I have a very high clearance within the government, when you're in that domain where you're pitching something to them and you may not have the same clearance level that the person has, a lot of times it'll feel like you're talking to a black hole. They are not able to say a lot back to you because it turns out some of the things that you're saying may either be something that they already know that's in the classified arena and they're not allowed to say it. Just because you say it and you can say it because you know it from a different perspective doesn't mean a government person can say it. So anytime you're dealing with classified information like that, and the cyber world is very classified very quickly, They will oftentimes listen, and they won't talk much about what actually technologies they sort of have behind the curtain. You can find those out if they think your idea is good, and they'll be able to tell you, you know, I'd really like you to propose against something that we have out there. So, you know, they'll give you a sense of like thumbs up or thumbs down, but they may not be able to tell you like, oh, well, that would work with my system over here, because that system name is probably even classified. So cybersecurity is a place where things get classified very quickly. And so just understand when you work with the government, NASIC's also that case, right? So you talk to NASIC, you got a great idea, you got an ATR algorithm you want to throw on a sensor. You think it's an awesome idea. Understand they may have to be entirely in receive mode because they can't tell you what that application for your technology might look like, but their wheels are spinning in their head, and you want to get those wheels spinning. And if you start seeing them nodding, you know, and giving you sort of positive body language, then you're probably in the right place. Yeah.
Another question. I was curious as to whether companies who did get a phase one, is there like some sort of database that shows like how well they did, and you reference that? This question comes from the fact that one of the companies that I worked with, we had a phase one, and then the subcontractor university partner we were with, like, they didn't do anything, and we struggled with that. And ever since that, we really haven't gotten much funding, and we're like, I wonder if they, you know, black marked us because of this one proposal, one program. I don't know, I'm just curious, do you guys look at past performance? Is there a grade that's going on behind?
So in terms of the government, the question is, you know, does the government look at past performance and or have a database that we look at for evaluating future proposals? And usually that is in the solicitation. It'll say, here's the database that we use. I'll say that from a technologist perspective, I rarely use those databases because they're very poor. They're not updated well. They're not put in with notes, for instance, that say, hey, this performer didn't answer my calls when I called him back, right? This performer didn't give me a good technical product. Instead, what will be in the database are things like, overall, this company has got X number of successes across its, you know, here's the amount of revenue that it got from those SIBRs. So anything on the SBA database, for instance. Now, technically, believe it or not, we can't even use that in the government to do our own evaluations unless it is in the solicitation that says we can look at the SBA data. And so if you look at the SIBRs calls, most of them don't say anything about that, which means I'm not allowed to look at it. As a matter of fact, just easy things like you would expect you put a link to your website, right, in your proposal, that they're going to go to your website, right? Well, it turns out I can't. Because if I did, I'd have to go to every website that was in any one of those SIBRs. And if I spent 10 minutes at your website, 20 minutes at this website, now all of a sudden I'm leveling again. So I can only evaluate what's in the paper. And the only thing that I can use then is what's in the back of my head from the relationships, from the discussions prior, to help me weigh, is it a B plus or a B minus? Any question?
So, I'm a little unclear as to whether you were able to move from a phase one STTR to a phase two STR. At some point, I think the app was put on the yes, and then it was no, and finally on. So what does that look like, and can companies make that switch? Because we have the same issue as research institution partners really would like to just go ahead and do it.
So the question is, if you start out in an STTR, say phase one, can you transition to a phase two SBIR from your phase one? I'll say that the law is not very clear there, and probably there are better people to answer that question specifically than I am. Afterwards, give me your card. I'll be happy to get you in contact with somebody, or John can do that as well. The reason why it's just not my specialty. SIBR sitters is something that I did during my job, but I was mostly on the technical side, not on the side of rules and what can happen from a rule-based system like that.
I think I understand it.
Right,
But the STTR, the efforts, this is
right.
kind of,
So,
you don't have to
so,
take
so I've been trying to get it, but there are some baselines here, like AFWorks is an organization, for instance, that funds small business innovative research, SBIRs. STTR is a version of a small business innovative research that also brings in an academic partner. So I'm certain we have some resources that we can give you in terms of that. I know we maintain some sort of acronym list, and quite a few places do that. I will say that the defense industry is very hard to penetrate in that sense. And if you think I'm talking acronym soup right now, you should see me at my real job, because right now I'm probably only about a 5 out of 100. And so, I could be talking about all these different program names and system names and so forth, and you can actually string along a sentence without actually saying a single word. So, and I've done it, and I've seen people do it. So, that said, the DoD is not very accessible in that regard. And the only thing I can say to that is there's some silver lining at the end, which is once you get into work with the DoD, you get a pretty strong revenue stream and a sustained revenue stream. Unlike industry, the DoD doesn't move as quickly, and so once you've got a funding stream, long term, it can result in a very good effort. For instance, there's a local company here called Tenet 3 that got a $250 million contract on the basis of a phase 2 SBIR. Now, I think they're probably funded around 10 or 11 million dollars on it right now. I'm guessing. That's my guess. I could be way off. But the point being is that now all of a sudden they've got a vehicle that they can drive a ton of money through and a ton of effort through because they've done these pieces. And so sometimes hunkering down and learning that acronym soup over time, and we can help you with that, and John can help you with that. Okay. Slide, please.
Can I ask one more quick thing?
Yeah.
Are those big dollar phase 3s pretty rare, or in any given year, is that handful of contractors getting those in the area?
So the question is, are those phase 3 big dollar contracts rare? Yes. They're rare for a variety of reasons. Usually you have to have a government sponsor. So when you go to a phase 1, you pitch an idea, and it's really mostly about your idea. The Air Force at large looks at it. You don't have to have a heavy relationship with the government, right? When you get into phase 2 and you actually are performing, you're going to have to start developing relationships with the government. Those relationships are going to be things like, I talked to a user, and I found out what their pain points are, and I changed my design based upon what their pain points are. Phase 3, I've got to have the government actually open up the checkbook. Phase 3s are not funded by the Small Business Administration. They are funded by someone else within the Air Force. And so you've got to make that transition from one customer to another customer to another customer. In this case, the phase 3s are oftentimes awarded to people that have been working with the DoD for some time. And so a lot of times what you see is that breakthrough doesn't happen on the first SBIR or the second SBIR, but maybe the fourth or the fifth SBIR, where you've now established a relationship and a pipeline. You've now understood the acronyms well enough to speak to the DoD intelligently. And so usually it isn't, it isn't like winning the lottery. It's usually a lot of hard work, and it's also a lot about knowing the right connections and having a great idea. So you've got to sort of, have multiple things in alignment to make that work. Okay, so I mentioned there's different criteria that are used, and those different criteria vary based upon the type of contract. So in SBIRs, in small business innovative research, there are 3 criteria, and that's the same with SITR. And those 3 criteria are, technical, commercialization, and qualifications of your personnel. And you'll see that they change how important commercialization is based upon if you're phase 1 or phase 2. So the numbers in terms of how you get to a grade matter. Now, I will tell you internally, I've had people say, you need to grade anything that is a winning proposal at a 99 or 100. And other organizations will say, no, you just grade it whatever you think it is, right? And there's a grading rubric associated with it. It'll say, here's what a very good is, right? This should include these sorts of things. And there were some things that I was looking for internally when I was evaluating a proposal. For instance, in commercialization, I would say, did they talk about the market? Did they talk about revenue streams or think about how their concept might fit within the broader community? Have they talked about competition, right? And I wasn't necessarily expecting all of those things, because to check all those things off takes a lot of space in a proposal, but I was expecting them to have some resonance, if you will, with, did they understand marketing, right? Did they understand how their technology is positioned within the greater universe? And so that would help me determine, was it a very good, an excellent, a marginal, satisfactory, or needs improvement, right? And then they had a number that you would give it, needs improvement equals, give it a 7, an 8, or 9. That's why I said you got a little bit of room you can work with, right? I can say it's a 7 versus an 8 or a 9, but I'm not necessarily going to be able to say it's a 15. So that's sitter, but for the research and development contracts, the bigger contracts that AFRL gives out, they're usually much more custom. They'll have a set of 6 criteria, and usually, and it'll be anywhere from 4 to 6, but it usually looks something like this. One will be like unique and innovative solutions proposed against this particular need, the soundness approach, including any risk mitigation, and they're going to be a little bit more wordy than what I have here, right? But the point is you want to key in on these, because this is your grading rubric, right? So they're going to grade you against these, because they can only grade your proposal against these criteria. And so it's very important to have those criteria right. You can get thrown out for format, but this will determine if you're actually going to be competitive. Okay, slide please. So the reviewer pool, I mentioned that, the government's not always the top technical people, and that's common. Oftentimes the reviewer pool is going to consist of a lot of younger people that are sort of up-and-comers within the government, and then a handful of older people. Most of your mid-career people are in high demand within the government, because the government sort of has a bathtub type distribution of personnel. We've got a lot of young guys, not a lot of guys in the middle, like I was in the government, and a lot of older guys that are retiring out because the baby boomers came in, and because of how the DoD just generally hired, they froze hiring during the Reagan years. And as a result, what happens is you either get young talent or you get old talent reviewing your SIBRs. So that's just sort of a general demographic of what you might be looking for. Don't make them work to find the criteria, right? That's just a generally a good rule. I mean, the government likes to be lazy anyway, and I can say that as a prior govie. If I can hit the easy button, I'll hit the easy button. If there isn't an easy button, I'll go make one, right? But I prefer to just go ahead and use the easy button I have in front of me. And so don't make them look for all of these criteria, right? If you've got, personnel, label the section personnel, right? That's an easy thing, right? Put it all in the same place. Don't have it strewn throughout your proposal. And so for some of these criteria, especially the prior ones that had a little bit more to do with, unique and innovative, you might say, this is a unique approach because you could even use that same word in their proposal, and that's kind of a best practice within the industry, is to use those type of words. I'd say don't overdo it, right? But you do want to sort of show them here's what you're looking for. I've even seen people in very large proposals put together what they call a matrix that says this criteria is evaluated against these paragraphs. So go to those paragraphs when you're looking for unique and innovative. Here's my unique and innovative paragraphs, right? And so that way the government doesn't have to, when they're going back and they're trying to fill out the form, they don't have to go back and reread the whole proposal. They can just go, okay, I go to here, 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 and here. And good government people we'll go beyond that and still find other places within your proposal. But I'll say, especially on the silver-sitter side of things, it's a numbers game. If I've got 45 proposals to read and I've got a week to evaluate those 45 proposals, I can only give you so much time. And so don't make it hard for me to find why your solution should be an A, not a C. Slide. Great proposals have a variety of different characteristics associated with them. I'll just run through these real quick. Contain a great idea. Talked about a great idea, for instance, earlier. You should be vetting them through the customer prior. They should be, 5 minutes, okay. They should be well articulated and accessible. 8th grade writing. Long sentences, passive voice generally don't work very well. You think if you're going to write something to academia, you sound smarter when you have long sentences. You sound smarter when you're talking about your idea in a very nuanced way. Well, the government's not got a lot of time, and they're not going to read a very complex sentence and go, eventually they'll go, huh? Okay, I'm going to skip that sentence and move on, as opposed to sit at that sentence and digest it until I understand the nuance of the sentence. So keep it very readable. Use graphics. Break your pages up with graphics is a very good idea. Generally, some people are visual and they want to read the graphics versus actually, read the proposal. So understand you've got a multiple reviewer audience here, so you don't want to necessarily just write it to one person. Make the evaluation easy, make things pop out in terms of where you find the criteria. Follow your formats fully and completely. Focus on what and how. So a lot of people will focus on, like, I've got this prior experience. This is why you should trust me. Well, trust me isn't a great strategy. And so focus on what's unique about your idea, how it's different from the other ideas out there. Focus on, so that's the what of the idea. And then focus on how you're going to make it work, right? Which will tell them, I have some confidence that they're going to be able to do it. Not based upon my prior research or prior work, but how I can make this get to a certain point. And then clearly identify your deliverables throughout the proposal. Slide. So this is an example of the Brad. I had a proposal from a civver, came in once, one of the 44 proposals in this case. And it was by a guy named Brad. And I'm not knocking Brad, so if there's a Brad in the audience, it's not that I'm knocking you. But Brad, in this case, wrote a 2-page proposal to a 10 or 15-page solicitation, right? And so it was clearly missing things. It didn't have a resume attached to it. It didn't have a title. It didn't have a company name. And so you don't want to be the Brad. Please, fill it out completely, right? If you're going to take a shot at the basket, try to actually hit the rim, and sometimes I'll see things that just don't even hit the rim, and this was a case where we were so far off it, I don't even think it went past half court, so it didn't tell a cohesive story. One thing I will recommend, especially for entrepreneurs, a lot of times you're going to write it yourself, get somebody else to read it. I mean, it sounds silly, but you got somebody else to read your resume, why wouldn't you have somebody else read your proposal, right? Find a trusted person that's going to read your proposal and go, you got a lot of errors in your proposal, or, this idea is buried really deep in the proposal. Use other people to help you sharpen your effort. Slide. So the ugly, I mentioned sometimes competition can be really tight. I remember a story when, 2 proposals were so tight that it came down to this proposal had a slight deficiency in travel. They didn't bid any travel at all. And this proposal over here bid labor that was a little unrealistic. So which one? And we deliberated and deliberated. It was almost a week's worth of deliberation over who was the right winner, if you will, for the proposal. So it can come down sometimes to the very, very thinnest of hairs, but I'll say most times it doesn't. Most times it's very clear who the winners are. Usually when I get a set of proposals, I throw them in a deck, and I say, goods, sort of goods, bads, right? And I spend most of my time in the sort of goods because I want to see if there's a gem in there that should be in my good pile. And so I triage proposals, and the goods get, enough time to justify why I pick them. The sort of goods are the ones where I'm looking for the gem, and the bads get very little of my time. Okay. So we at time yet? Okay, I think I got one more slide I can run through real quick. And so the silver lining with this is, as I sort of mentioned earlier, is that once you're in with the government, a lot of times you've got a continued revenue source, right? And you've got a continued partnership with the government. And so there can be some really good things about the government. I mean, you look at industry, and you can make or break based upon your profit to loss ratio. On the government, you're getting usually reimbursed for your time and effort, and you're making a profit on the top of it. Now, you might not be making a 20% profit, but you also don't have as much risk in the government. So there's some really good things about working for the government. So I encourage you, as you go through that learning curve, to realize that there's some real reasons why you might want to stick to the government, despite the fact that the government speaks a completely different language.